Good morning, everyone. Welcome to what I will describe as a little history lesson. But before we get started, for those that I've not had, I'm Tony Grinberg. I was elected to the Fargo City Commission in 2016 and was assigned, actually was asked if I'd be on the Planning Commission and oversee as the liaison as City Commissioner, which I said yes. And I got to tell you, I've learned a lot about planning in the 2.5 years working with the members of the Planning Commission. And so as a result of planning and thinking to the future, what I don't know that many people know is that through circumstances and flooding, the city of Fargo acquired the Mid-America Steel site, and they're building a new operation out of the industrial park. So what does that mean? That means in the future, that site will be raised and leveled in a vacant lot, if you will, prime for development, that the city of Fargo owns. And certainly with the growth of our downtown and the efforts going on in Moorhead as a region and two communities, it's in my opinion, a premier spot to think about the future. So here about 6 weeks ago, Mark Peel popped into my mind. And what's telling about that, we grew up close to each other, Mapleton, North Dakota, and Hunter, but I met him, I think we concluded in 1987 when I heard him speak about the history of Fargo-Moorhead in the Prohibition days, I think was one of the points of your presentation. And I thought about Mark, and I hadn't seen him since 1987. And so how do I get a hold of Mark? And I said, you know, would you be interested in talking about the history of this site and the history of our two communities, really as a history lesson about the past, to really start a dialogue about this site and thinking about the future. Because as the City Commission, Commissioner Pepcorn is here, and I and the other members of the Commission and the Planning Commission, and at some point we're going to put together some type of approach or a strategy about that site. So today is really about education and learn about our past, and then I hope you think about some of the opportunities as we go forward as a region and a community. So with that, Mark, take it away.
Okay, thank you. Well, okay, thanks for everybody coming out today. We got a big crowd. I was not expecting this at all. This is fantastic. My talk about Mid-America Steel site is going to be pretty short. It's only about 20 minutes or so. So I was thinking afterwards, if you don't mind, I might switch gears a little bit and talk to you a little bit about the Fargo and Moorhead Electric Street Railway system, the electric streetcar system that we had before we had a bus system here in Fargo-Moorhead. And with that, I'll get going here. The Mid-America Steel site, I guess I've always thought of it as an industrial site, but this is the place that we're talking about. But when I started doing a little bit of studying, I didn't go into, it's not a full site analysis that I've done. I didn't get the opportunity to go through city directories, for instance, to track the up and flow of individual businesses down on the site, or land records to see who actually owned partial properties. I focused primarily on photographs and Sanborn fire insurance maps, which I'll describe here in a little bit. But I did come away with about maybe 3 takeaways that I learned about the site. And I'm not sure if this pointer is going to function up there or not. Doesn't appear to be. This is the site at any rate. And the first takeaway that I found, and I looked at it primarily in the 19th and early 20th centuries, there really were 3 different districts, if you will, in this area. This, of course, is NP Avenue right here, and it's bounded by NP Avenue on the north, Main Avenue on the south, 2nd Street, and the Red River on the east. And it's basically this bend in the river here. And the first area that I recognized is this area right here, just north of the NP Avenue Bridge. That was the waterfront. That's where the steamboats tied up in the 1870s and 1880s. And it was a very, very busy place at that time. The Grandin brothers had their operation here on this side. The Elsop brothers on the Moorhead side just immediately cross over here. The second place is on the low ground right here, just immediately to the south of the steamboat area. And that was actually, it was a residential neighborhood, arguably the earliest residential neighborhood for the city of Fargo. I'm not quite sure how long that lasted, probably until the 1897 flood. There were probably people still living down there. It may have been later than that. There are certainly low-lying areas in Moorhead, back behind the Yamcom Center in the Woodlawn Park area that regularly got flooded as well, but there were homes down there until the 1970s and even into the 80s. And then the third area is up on the high ground here, and that's where Mid-America Steel is located, most of their operations. And for lack of a better term, I talk about that as the industrial zone. This is the earliest photograph we have of Fargo-Moorhead. This shows the Selkirk, Steamboat Selkirk, underneath the unfinished railroad bridge. This picture was taken in the spring of 1872. We're looking from Moorhead to the southwest, from about the end of the Moorhead Center Avenue right here, looking across the river. And this is where the railroad bridge still stands today in downtown Fargo-Moorhead. The Northern Pacific Railway, as they're building west across Minnesota, realized that wherever the railroad crossed the river, major cities would develop, mainly because it's a water source. So they wanted to control the crossing and be able to sell the property when they got here. So they kept the official crossing spot secret. In the summer of 1872, they set out a false set of stakes running northwest from where Hawley is today up to a point along the Red River in what's now Oakport Township. People assumed that was where the crossing was going to be. During that summer, there were hundreds of people living in tents up there at that crossing in the middle of Oakport Township. In September of 1872, or 1871 rather, the Northern Pacific announced where the crossing was actually going to be. There was a mass migration. Several hundred people moved down from Oakport Township to what's now Fargo-Moorhead, established businesses and built things. On the Fargo side, there were recognized two communities. One of them was called Fargo on the Prairies, if you can see way up here in the distance, and that was primarily the engineers and the some business leaders, more industrious, sober individuals, basically, up there between 4th and Broadway, basically, along Main Avenue. Poorer folks, immigrants, prostitutes, gamblers, saloon owners, tended to congregate down in this lower bend in the river, where Mid-America Steel has some operations now, and that was called Fargo in the Timber. Incidentally, the site up in Oakport Township, after they left that, later on it was known as Bogusville. But this down here was the beginning. You can see some tents off here in the distance, and that's Fargo in the Timber. This is a few years later. This is pictures taken in 1880. We're looking to the south here from a grain elevator, Union elevator that sat on basically between what's now Elm Street and the Red River around 3rd Avenue North, okay, just across from where the new City Hall is located now. And we're looking to the south here in this image, and you can see the waterfront off here in the distance. The Grandin Lines operation, they had a couple of warehouses right on the riverbank. Their own oddly shaped elevator A right down here for transmitting wheat from steamboats and barges stored in the elevator, and it could be shipped by market by loading it onto railroad cars on these spur lines that were built down along the river by the Northern Pacific Railway. The Alsop brothers, again, had their operation on the Moorhead side. It was the Grandin brothers over here. The Grandin brothers owned Bonanza Farms. They owned a huge Bonanza farm across the river from Halstead, Minnesota, and they had their own steamboat, the J.L. Grandin, and its primary function is to haul wheat down to this elevator here from that farm across from Halstead. In this photograph, also on the extreme off on the right in the distance, behind the steamboat area, you can see homes down there. Little homes plopped willy-nilly all over that. That area was never platted for streets and alleys and things like that, blocks and lots. So those homes are just plotted just about any place. This is actually a better view of the same area. This is from a lithograph, bird's eye view of Fargo. These bird's eye views of various cities were extremely popular in the 19th century. They were drawn for a local market, so they had to be fairly accurate. So this, again, we're looking at, in this case, to the southwest. This is the bend in the river, the steamboat area right here, the railroad tracks. Front Street, or Main Avenue, in those days it was called Front Street. And you'll notice plopped willy-nilly all over out here, about 25 homes. And that's the second thing that I noticed here, that there wasn't a whole lot of industrialization of this area until well into the 20th century. But the only industry that I see is this one building down here that has a smokestack with smoke pouring out of it, and I believe that's a planing mill. The Northern Pacific did build branch lines, spur lines down here to feed that planing mill, and also the other industrial area along the Red River up toward the old City Hall parking lot area and Union Grain Elevator, the really industrialized sections. I learned quite a bit by studying the Sanborn fire insurance maps. I mentioned them earlier. These were highly detailed street maps that were drawn of cities all over the country from the mid-1800s to the mid-1900s, including Fargo and Moorhead. They came out every few years. And they were designed to provide fire insurance companies with detailed information about individual buildings, how far they were from fire hydrants, the size of water mains in the streets, and what the buildings are used for. And they were quite precise and quite accurate, and they give us a good picture of what the communities looked like at various different times. They come out every few years. This is the earliest one that we have that shows part of this neighborhood down here. 1884, the Sanborn Company mapped Fargo and Moorhead. And at this point, we see here, this is, of course, NP Avenue. You can see up here, 2nd Street off on the left. The steamboat operation down here on the river, good indication of the precise location of those warehouses and their grain elevator. And about the only industrial activity that we see here in this site here is that's the Johnson and Nelson planing mill. And there's a notation on it. I doubt you can read it, but it says closed. That was another thing that I noticed as I was going through here. There was a lot of churn in businesses. They'd remain in operation for a couple, 3 years, and then by the time the next map came out, they'd be somebody completely different down there. The next map that came out was 1888. That shows the area a little bit better. By 1888, there was a little bit more development. The area was being used by the Fargo Lumber Company for storage. See those dotted rectangles up there in the upper left in the center of the photograph or image up here. There's also TD Green Lumber Company has their yard out there. The planing mill is still there, but on this map it says to be removed. So it had been closed for some time as well. In 1888, I noticed a couple of other things. I want to go back here just a second here. In 1884, right here at the very bottom, it says no exposure. That indicates that to the south of this area mapped, there wasn't anything that had value enough so that they would bother to map this area down here. So the homes down in that area must have been considerably substandard. And another thing I noticed too, on this map from 1888, on the extreme right over there, you see the little blue arrow pointing down toward a couple of buildings. It says shanties, and that gives you an indication of what the neighborhood is like down there, kind of like this. This picture was taken sometime after 1885. This is actually on the south side of Main Avenue, between Main Avenue and the river. We're looking north here from Woodlawn Park, and those are homes. The one thing I think people forget is there was tremendous grinding poverty in Fargo Moorhead in the 19th century, and lots of folks lived in hovels like this. This is the area that we're talking about here. This is in the flood of 1881. Of course, this is a low-lying area, no industrial activity down there, but lots of poor folk. In 1882, the following year, there was even worse flood. And of course, in 1897, there was the second worst in recorded history around here. And that may have been the end of it. We've reports of, in the 1897 flood, of buildings floating away, just washing away and taken off downstream. And if you look very closely, that center shanty right here has what appears to be a cable around it, tied off to a tree to keep it from floating away. This is 1892, this is the next one, and there's basically nothing going on out here. These spur lines that the railroad had built down here in the 1880s were just essentially unused. This is 1896, and finally we're getting some development down in the area. The Pacific Lumber Company has built an operation up there on First Street and NP Avenue. And the J.I. Case Machinery Company has built a storage warehouse down there along that spur line immediately to the south. I think that thing worked. In 1901, starting with the 1901 Sanborn maps, we don't have them in color anymore, but we do have them in black and white. These are scanned from microfilm, so we lose the color, which codes what type of building materials they were made from. But essentially, they show the same sort of information. And a couple of things kind of surprised me on this 1901 map. The industrial area really hasn't changed that much. J.I. Case is there, and now it's the Valley Lumber Company, who is the Pacific Lumber Company up there above. But down at the bottom where that blue arrow was pointing, I found this. There was a kindergarten there. I had to do a little research on that. There is a young woman in 1890 named Laura Burchell, who decided to set up basically a preschool for the kids in the First Ward neighborhood down there, that poor section of town down on what was called at the time Lower Front Street, the east end of Main Avenue, it was part of the urban renewal later on. And she had kind of a quasi-official relationship with the city school system. They gave her a certain amount of money, a small stipend, and she made reports back to the school system every year. But she had about 50 kids enrolled in her kindergarten down there, preschool kids. And the main educational function of the preschool was to teach these kids English. They were almost all immigrants down there, and to provide them with basic information about how to be a good American citizen. That's where her focus was. And that remained down there for until at least 1910. Another thing that I noticed here in this area in 1901, up at the very top, you see that blue arrow pointing down to a couple of small buildings right there on NP Avenue. This is a restaurant. There's a lady in 1899 started this restaurant. Lena Lake was her name. She was a German. She was married to a Frank Lake, who was from Finland. They lived in that little house. It's marked D for dwelling, and they had a restaurant next door and a boarding house upstairs. In some cases, the restaurant is indicated as a lunchroom. In those days, if you were unmarried, or most married guys just went home for lunch. And if you lived too far from home to do that, or if you were single, rather than carrying your lunch to work, a lot of times guys would go to the lunchrooms. And I think that was what this is all about, to feed those fellows that were working in the more industrialized area up around where the City Hall parking lot was until recently. So if somebody decides to build a restaurant down in this neighborhood down here, might consider naming it after Lena Lake. The last takeaway I noticed was the real sudden development in this area down here between the years 1901 and 1905. And that corresponds with the period when the Fargo-Moorhead Electric Street Railway was constructed. Before we had buses for our mass transit needs, we had an electrically powered street railway. And it started operations in 1904. They started constructing to put in the infrastructure into the streets late in 1903. It was completed by Thanksgiving of 1904. And the company needed a car barn repair shops for their streetcars. And they built a place right at the corner of NP Avenue, south side of NP Avenue, right at First Street. The streetcar system proved extremely popular. The company bought 8 cars from the Cleveland Car Company. Almost immediately, they needed to double the number of cars that they had because the streetcars are so popular. So that meant they needed a bigger warehouse or a bigger storage facility for their equipment. They abandoned the site almost immediately down there on NP Avenue and built a new car barn up on 3rd Avenue North between 11th and 12th Street. I believe there's a big apartment building up there now. And they abandoned this place. That was when Fargo Foundry took over, and that eventually became Mid-America Steel. Again, there was a very rapid development of this, industrial development of this neighborhood during this time period. This is what it looked like in 1901, and by 1905, when the next one came out, you can see there's quite a bit of activity down there. Everything from Fargo Foundry had taken this over by now. This had been the car repair shops up here for the streetcar system. And there's also a lumber yard up over here, stockyards to the south and the east. A company called the Miracle Pressed Stone Company was making cinder blocks basically right here. And the Wilson Stone Company was also in operation down on Main Avenue. So very quickly this developed into what we see much, much later. This is the first aerial photograph that we've got of the site. It was taken by the U.S. Department of Agriculture in 1939. And you can see by this time the steamboat area has been completely discombobulated. This is all dug out. There's no physical evidence of the steamboat operations because of the development of the Center Avenue, NP Avenue Bridge. And you'll also notice that there aren't any homes down here anymore. They probably had disappeared somewhere in the previous 20 or 30 years. And that's what I have for you today about that. If anybody has any questions or comments, I'd like to take them. Otherwise, I can talk about a different topic, the Fargo-Moorhead Electric Street Railway. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Just one question, focusing on the bridges. They're the remnants of a bridge. I can't quite remember where it is.
Yes.
What is that?
That was called by many people the streetcar bridge. That would make sense as part of the reason that they built the building where they did. There were two wagon bridges between Fargo and Moorhead starting in the 1880s. It always takes 10 or 20 years to get a bridge built between Fargo and Moorhead. People are arguing about where they're going to build them and whatnot. So in 1872, when the Northern Pacific Railway built the railroad bridge across, that for 12 years was the only bridge back and forth, official bridge back and forth. People argued about whether to build a wagon bridge on the north side of the downtowns or one on the south side of the downtowns. People needed a way to get back and forth across. Some people used the railroad bridge, which was dangerous and technically illegal. But beginning in the late 1870s, just about every year, somebody, an enterprising local, would build a temporary bridge right at the water level, generally just north of the Northern Pacific Railway Bridge to get back and forth across. But they'd have to take it out every spring, wait for the flood to get over and put a new bridge back in. They did that every year basically for 12 years. In 1884, they finally compromised, and instead of building one bridge, they built two crappy bridges, essentially. The Main Avenue Bridge, the South Bridge, was not built very effectively, but they slapped it up. And there was another bridge called the North Bridge, which the one that you're referring to here ran from NP Avenue to the northeast toward where American Crystal Sugar has their downtown headquarters on the Moorhead side. And there's a big concrete footing of that bridge that sticks out of the river down below American Crystal. And that's the remnants of that bridge. And in 1905, when the streetcar system started operating, that was the bridge that they used to go back and forth between Fargo and Moorhead. It's conveniently located right outside their initial car repair shops. And that one was torn down in 1942 after it was replaced by the First Avenue North Bridge in 29 and 30. Any other questions, or did I scare somebody off? Okay, let me where is my, there we go. Okay, well, I'll talk about the Fargo-Moorhead Electric Street Railway a little bit more in depth. And to start off with, I'm going to take this is a shot of Moorhead. This is in 1880, October of 1880, and we're looking to the southeast from the top of a flour mill that sat on the Moorhead side of the river just south of Main Avenue. And here in 1880, it looks like there wasn't much need for mass transit, basically, in Fargo-Moorhead. But a couple of things about this photograph that stand out. One, look how far apart all those homes are. In those days, if you needed to get any distance, you needed a horse and a buggy, basically, to get around. People owned animals, and those animals take a lot of space. So both Fargo and Moorhead, as they developed in the 1870s and 1880s, expanded very, very broadly. most cases, there were only 1 or 2 homes on an entire city block because you needed space for those animals. And also at the same time, in the early 1880s, both Fargo and Moorhead were growing very, very quickly. By 1882, some people here in Fargo decided, well, you know, we're getting to the point where we're so scattered out, we're going to need a way to get people from the outlying parts of town downtown so they can work and shop and do whatever they need to do. We need a mass transit system, a system of transportation on a regular route with a regular timing. So in 1882, a company started a horse-drawn streetcar system. And it was fairly short-lived. The tracks essentially ran down Broadway. They put actual railroad tracks, narrow-gauge railroad tracks in the streets and used 1 horse or 1 mule to haul these carriages around, these little railroad cars. Now, the tracks ran in Fargo from about 6th or 7th Avenue North, down Broadway, down to west on Main Avenue. They went west on Main out to about 9th Street, and then south down to about 5th Avenue South. And that was pretty much the extreme edge of town in 1882 at that time. And this is what the tracks look like. This is Broadway looking south from just north of NP Avenue. You can see Island Park off in the distance, so you can see the tracks right here. Well, they gave limited service throughout that summer and into the fall of 1882. It was a wet summer. And unfortunately, when they built the tracks, when they put the tracks in the streets, they didn't put enough ballasting, enough sand and rock underneath the tracks and the ties. So when these little railroad cars rolled across the tracks in this wet weather, it would pound those tracks right into the ground. And they had to be constantly repairing the rails. It gave limited service. People couldn't rely on it, and it started hemorrhaging money. And the company had a mysterious fire at their car barn shops that fall. They got their horses out, they got their the cash out, but they lost all their rolling stock. They made it an adjustment with their insurance company, presumably, and that was it for mass transit in Fargo-Moorhead for some time. But in the late 1880s were a time of tremendous technological change. You know, we see technology change during our lives every day here in our time period. But the same thing was true in the late 1800s. Everything from telegraph and telephone, early radio and motion pictures and electric lights, all of this developed very quickly in the late 1800s. In the late 1880s, there were dramatic improvements in the quality and power of electric motors. So for the first time, mass transit dreamers had a different way of moving people around rather than using steam or horses. They could use electricity. And in the 1890s, there were a number of companies that came into Fargo-Moorhead offering to build us an electrically powered street railway system. And generally, the companies would say, here's a deal, we'll build a system that will link your 2 downtowns. And this is a little map that shows the locations of the streets, or the bridges rather, over the Red River between the 2 cities. And almost invariably, the company says they will build a streetcar line running down Broadway down to Front Street, or what's now Main Avenue, and we'll go over to Moorhead on the South Bridge, over to 4th Street, north on 4th Street, past downtown, up to what was 2nd Avenue North up here, where American Crystal Sugar has their headquarters, and then loop back over to NP Avenue and make a continuous loop. And it's interesting to see the way the 2 cities approach these companies differently. Invariably in Fargo, folks will say, sounds great, where do we sign up? We'd love to have a streetcar system. But Moorhead was always more reticent. There were people in Moorhead that, there was one businessman that said that there wasn't a horse in Clay County that would share a bridge with a streetcar. They were afraid of losing the use of the bridges. Other business people in Moorhead said, well, all this streetcar system would do would make it easier for people from Moorhead to go over to Fargo to do their shopping. That was pretty much what most of it was about. So Fargo would say yes, Moorhead would say no. And this is the North Bridge. You asked about the North Bridge. This is the concrete footing, like I say, still sticks out of the river. This is looking from the Fargo side over toward Moorhead. And on the Fargo side, when the water is low, you can actually see the concrete footings for these 2 concrete footings sticking out of the water. Finally, in 1904, another company came in from Pennsylvania and had a lot of capital. They had $250,000 to work with. In 1904, that was quite a bit of money. So they said to the people in Moorhead, well, here's the deal. We'll build a streetcar line that will link the 2 downtowns. But, you know, you've got MSUM sitting all by itself with the normal school, a mile out in the countryside, and we'll build a streetcar line out to the college. And you've also got Clay County Courthouse. It's a half mile out in the prairie all by itself, and we'll build a streetcar line out there too. So people in Fargo and Moorhead hemmed and hawed. In 1900, Moorhead got a new city charter that said that any franchise to use the streets for a streetcar system or whatnot, or to any changes in that franchise, had to go to a vote of the people. In Fargo, the city council, or I guess it was a council form of government at that time, could say yes or no on an issue like that, but in Moorhead it had to go to a vote of the people. So people in Moorhead hemmed and hawed all through the summer of 1904. Finally, these folks got tired and they took their money elsewhere. This guy, L.B. Hanna, later on he was governor of North Dakota, he was an attorney from Fargo. He headed up a group of local investors to take over the project. And he said, here's the deal, folks, in Moorhead, we'll build the line to the street, out to the college, we'll build the line to the county courthouse, but we'll only use one bridge, the North Bridge here, and we'll use it only for 2 years. In 1906, after 2 years, we'll build a streetcar-only bridge immediately north of this bridge here, and you can go back to using the North Bridge. So people discussed it in Moorhead. They went to the polls, and turned out they voted overwhelmingly in favor of this streetcar system. Well, by now it's November of 1904, and the company had to really scramble to get the infrastructure built into the streets. This is Center Avenue in Moorhead. We're looking north from between 4th and 5th Street, so the Moorhead Center Mall parking lot will be right here today. And these guys are building the streetcar tracks right down the middle of Center Avenue. This is not light rail. It's not what the Twin Cities had. This is standard gauge, 4 feet, 8.5 inches wide. They used 90-pound rail. In other words, a 3-foot section of rail would weigh 90 pounds. You could drive a steam locomotive up and down this thing. By Thanksgiving Day, 1904, the operations are ready to begin over in Fargo, and they were extremely popular, extremely popular. The newspapers claimed that 10,000 people rode the streetcar the first day of operation. That was about the population of Fargo at the time. It's possible that everybody showed up. More likely, as people came from all over the area. Really, in 1904, there were very few automobiles. Any kind of means of transportation that didn't have a steam engine belching smoke or a couple of mules or a horse in front of it were quite an innovation. They started running over in Moorhead in early December, and the streetcars started using the North Bridge. You can see the streetcar coming across from Fargo going over to Moorhead. And as it turned out, they didn't have to worry about horses getting scared, and it wasn't a real problem. So the city of Moorhead relented in 1906, and they said, well, you don't have to build a streetcar-only bridge. You can continue using the old North Bridge. But every year from then on until the end of the streetcar line, every spring, the company had to come to the City Council of Moorhead to renegotiate a lease from the Moorhead end of this bridge. So where did they run? This is the route on the Moorhead side. I came across, of course, from Fargo, across the old North Bridge, up to what was called 2nd Avenue North, over to 4th Street, and then down 4th Street to Front Street. Now, in Fargo, Front Street's Main Avenue. In Moorhead, Front Street is Center Avenue. That used to confuse people. People would be coming across from Front Street in Fargo, and all of a sudden Front Street's a block north. So in late in 1923, the city of Moorhead changed the name Front Street to Center Avenue. But there were a couple of north and south lines. There was a line that continued down here to 10th Street, and then north all the way up to 9th Avenue North, up there where the Clay County Courthouse is located, and later on St. Ansgar Hospital was constructed up here, mostly because it was along the streetcar line. And then there was another line that went down 6th, down here to 5th Avenue South, and then via 9th Street and 7th Avenue South out to MSUM. Later on, there was a separate line that was built along 2nd Avenue North out to Dilworth, and another one that ran down here to the 2nd Ward and the Concordia College area, and I'll talk more about those in a little bit. This is the North Bridge again. There's the Moorhead side over here. You can see the streetcars coming from Moorhead over toward Fargo. The streetcar bridge that's what most people called it, was the streetcar bridge. It curved right here just as you got to the Fargo side. This is MSUM, about 1905. Not a lot out there at that time. The only reason that Moorhead has the college is because of a fellow named Solomon Comstock. Comstock was a member of the Minnesota State Senate in the 1880s, and he was also a real estate developer and a very successful attorney. He was a county attorney, and he offered to donate land for the college out here to the state of Minnesota if they would build the college at Moorhead. And they took him up on it. The college wound up in Moorhead. And it wasn't completely altruistic on Comstock's part. He also owned a lot of the land in between downtown Moorhead and this site out there. And he hoped that if the college was built out there, the city would grow in that direction and the value of his property would go up. Well, it didn't really happen until until the streetcar line started running out there. Suddenly people didn't need a horse and a buggy to get around. They could get around by the streetcar. They could go any place in town practically for a nickel. That's what it was initially. The fare was a nickel. So all these big city blocks with 1 and 2 homes on them got broken up into smaller and smaller lots, and both cities developed more complex, concentrated development system. In Fargo, the tracks ran on a couple of different route loops, north and south. Streetcar track, they came across the bridge to NP Avenue, down to Broadway. There was a turnaround area right here in downtown Fargo. And on the south side, there was a loop that ran down to Front Street, or Main Avenue today, out to 9th Street, and then down to 2nd Avenue South. And then the way the heck gone out to 14th Street, actually a little beyond the edge of the built-up city, down to 5th Avenue South, and back via 9th Street, and 9th Avenue South, and 4th Street past St. John's Hospital, and made this loop down here. There was some speculation in the newspapers about why the company built the streetcar line all the way out here to 14th Street when there's very few people living there. And they suggested it might be because there was a fellow named John Johnson, the mayor of Fargo, lived right here on 3rd Avenue South and 14th. And it's possible he may have used his political pull to get the streetcar line built to his house. But if he did, the joke was on him, because the really good property was not right on the streetcar line itself, but about a block or so off. That way you had easy access to the streetcars, but you didn't have this clanging, banging, noisy streetcar going past your house every 20 minutes or so. And they started at about 6:30 in the morning, and they went till almost midnight. On the north side, there were a couple of loops. There was one that ran up Broadway to 6th Avenue North and took a jog over to 7th Street and ran up to 12th Avenue North and out to the NDAC, North Dakota Agricultural College, NDSU, of course, today, and then south on what's now University Drive to 4th Avenue North, and then via 11th Street, I believe that is right here, to 2nd and 3rd Avenue, and that's where their new car repair shops were. This is where their old ones had been, and made a complete loop. There was another loop that went up, took off from Broadway on 6th Avenue North over to 4th Street, and North made a loop up this way to continue around. In 1906, 2 years after the first streetcar line was built, the state fairgrounds were built up in where Fargo North High School is located. The streetcar line built an extension out here to the fairgrounds and that neighborhood up there. And as late as the 1920s, when there was inclement weather, the streets are so lousy up there that that was practically the only way realistically you could get to the fairgrounds was via the streetcar line. This is Broadway. We're looking south from NP Avenue, and look at it. There's a big crowd out there on Broadway. You get about the only time we see that is about 2 o'clock in the morning, I think, now on Broadway. But just about all those folks got down there either by walking or by the streetcar. It was extremely popular. The animals managed to get up to the fairgrounds by the streetcar line as well. The streetcar company would unload the animals on the steam railroads in Northern Pacific, Great Northern, load them onto railroad cars like this one up here, and then they used their snow plow, which presumably they wouldn't need during the summer when the fair was on. They used the snowplow to haul the animals up to the fairgrounds. And actually, until the streetcar started running in 1904, there wasn't much need to clear the streets of snow in Fargo-Moorhead. Basically, people, if the snow got to be too deep for horses and wagons, they would just level off the drifts and switch to horses and sleighs, so they put runners on the wagon wheels and get around that way. But once the streetcar started running, they actually had to remove the snow from at least the streetcar tracks. Well, where'd the power come from? It was generated at the Union Heat, Light, and Power Company. It was a privately owned utility that provided electricity for Fargo at the time. They had a generating plant. I still think of it as the Herbst parking lot back behind Broadway, between Broadway and the old Northern School Supply building down near the railroad tracks. This is their power plant. It provided DC power, direct current power, just like comes off our batteries. The electrons flow in one direction. They come off the positive pole, flow through the wire, flow through, in this case, a little light bulb lighting up, and then return to the negative pole over here, making a complete circuit. Streetcar operated essentially the same way. The power is generated at the powerhouse. It went out, was distributed to the streetcars by a big, heavy, uninsulated copper cable that was suspended above the streetcar tracks along the whole of the route with an intricate system of wires, support system. So the electricity came out from the powerhouse, went out through the cable. In each of the streetcars had an arm at the top, which was spring-loaded. It was forced upward. At the end of the arm was a little wheel, a trawler wheel or trolley wheel. That's where they get the term trolley car. And as the streetcar rolled along, the power would come out from the powerhouse, down through the wheel, down through the arms, to the electric motors that propelled the streetcar, and then returned to the powerhouse through the steel wheels and rails or the ground and made a complete circuit like this. There was no danger of getting electrocuted unless you were tall enough to touch the cable up above and the ground at the same time, and the cable was 18 to 23 feet up in the air, so there wasn't much danger of that. In November of 1930, however, there was a nasty wind and ice storm, and here a telephone pole has come down to cause the streetcar some grief, and there must have been tremendous snapping and banging when that power cable hit the ground. This is streetcar number 5. This is leaving downtown Moorhead. This is Center Avenue here. It's turning right on 4th Street, and you can see that arm sticking up here and keeping that cable, or that wheel in contact with the cable running around here, and that intricate system of wires that was necessary to support the streetcar. A lot of people in Moorhead used this as an excuse to oppose the streetcar system. They were afraid that all these wires would make their city look ugly. This is number 8, streetcar number 8. As I mentioned before, they almost immediately had to double the number of streetcars. They bought another 8. The first ones they got from, I think it said the Cleveland Company. Was mistaken about that. It was the Niles Car Company from Cleveland, Ohio. And the Niles Company built some of the best streetcars ever made. These are fantastic, as good as any streetcars running anywhere in the world. They're just absolutely gorgeous. The replacement one, so the second 8 they got secondhand from the Minneapolis-St. Paul streetcar system. They built their own cars down in Minneapolis and also built very, very good cars. In the old photographs, they look black, but actually they were a deep, dark green color. Beautiful finish on them, gold pinstriping. They had double-paned windows for insulation. This clerestory-style windows up here and this monitor-style roof that could be opened for create more ventilation that let in a little more light. They were electrically lit, of course. Behind the motorman right here, if you look closely, there's a little coal stove right here, and there's a copper coil in it, and it circulated hot water heat throughout the streetcar to keep people warm. They had rattan seats, and really quite comfortable. It was a good ride and relatively inexpensive. They did have cow catchers or fenders out on the front and back here designed to trip up and catch any unwary pedestrians, and that happened. There were a number of fatal accidents in Fargo-Moorhead. They were rigged for dual end operation. When the streetcar reached the end of the line, they didn't have to turn it around and send it back the other way. The motorman here and the conductor would switch places. The motorman would remove his control device that he has right here, switch places with the conductor on the back, reinstall it here, and you can see this arm sticking up with the wheel in contact with the cable, where there's a rope attached to this. He'd pull down on that rope, and there was another arm at the other end of the streetcar, and he would raise that one, and they just back the other direction, just switch ends. They worked a little differently than our buses do today. When you wanted to get onto the streetcar, you stand on the corner and you would wave so that the motorman would see you, and he would stop so that you were oriented at the back platform. You'd enter through the rear. Once you were safely aboard, the conductor back here would ring a gong, and that would tell the motorman it was safe for him to proceed. You go take your seat, and you get almost to where your destination is, and between each one of these windows was a little electric buzzer. You buzz that, that would tell the conductor you wanted to get off. He'd ring his gong, the motorman would stop, and you would exit through the rear, and you paid your fare as you got off. And like I say, initially it was a nickel. You could buy paper tickets at a discount, and once you were safely off the streetcar, he'd ring his gong again. It was a noisy operation. There's an old Judy Garland movie, there's a song Clang, Clang, Clang with the trolley, and that's what they're talking about here. This is a noisy operation. Kids would play havoc with the streetcar line. I mentioned the cow catchers out here. Many, many people told me when they were little kids, so they would run out here, and when the motorman wasn't looking, they'd jump on to the back and get a free of somewhat dangerous ride around town. In fact, within weeks of when the streetcar system started operating in 1904, the company had to put notices in the paper saying, parents, please keep your kids off the back of the streetcar. Somebody's going to get hurt one of these days. I don't think anybody ever did, but it was a constant problem. Kids would also play havoc, but sometimes they'd run out there and they'd grab this rope and pull it off, and that would stop the streetcar in its tracks. It would go off its trolley. One of our volunteers said a good hard-packed snowball, if you could hit that wheel up there at the top, would affect the same result. We don't have many hills in town, but there is one on 4th Street down in front of Prairie Psychiatric Center down Prairie St. John's. And when the streetcar was going up that hill, especially on Halloween, one of our volunteers said they would grease the tracks there. And when the streetcar got halfway up, they'd run and grab that wheel, pull it off, and then the streetcar would just sit there and spin. You have to back up way up to practically First Avenue South to get a run at it again. I think that's what I wanted to say about that. The company did pretty darn well at the early part of the 20th century. In 1910, however, there was a fellow named H.M. Billingsby who owned a company in Pennsylvania. It was called Consumers Power Company, and he would go around the country buying up privately owned utilities and struggling streetcar lines and run them under greater economies of scale under his umbrella of Consumers Power Company. In 1910, he bought Union Heat, Light, and Power and the streetcar company. So for the first time, both the utility and the streetcar company were owned by the same outfit. 2 years later, in 1912, he changed its name to Northern States Power, NSP. It's Xcel Energy today. It still provides us here in Fargo with all of our electricity needs. But when Billingsby acquired this, in 1912, he decided he wanted a new franchise. I think they had gotten a 15-year franchise in 1904. He wanted a 25-year franchise. And that, of course, had to go to a vote of the people of Moorhead. So in order to sweeten the pot, he had to offer something to the voters in Moorhead. So he said, if you give me a 25-year franchise to use the streets, I'll build a streetcar line out to this brand new town just established called Dilworth. Now, just a few years before, in 1906, the Northern Pacific Railway had division headquarters every 100 miles along the tracks. You could only expect a steam locomotive to go about 100 miles before it had to be refit and refurbished and whatnot. So there was a division headquarters at Staples, Minnesota, one at Fargo, one at Jamestown, one at Mandan, Glendive, and so on off to the west. Well, they ran out of room to expand the Fargo operation. So in 1906, they decided to move everything from Fargo out to a little tiny railroad siding called Dilworth, a little 3 miles east of Moorhead. And they did that. In 1906, very suddenly, Dilworth popped up by 1910. It was one of the larger cities in the county. And most of those folks worked for the Northern Pacific Railway. Well, there were a lot of people that lived in Fargo-Moorhead but worked for the railroad out of Dilworth. And the railroad, at the same time, around 1912, announced that they were going to stop. They used to run a separate line, the Dinky line, out to Dilworth for these employees. And they said they were going to stop doing that. Well, it was perfect timing for Billingsby. He said, well, I'll build a streetcar line so you folks can continue living in Fargo-Moorhead and paying your taxes there, but you can take the streetcar out to work. So it went to a vote of the people of Moorhead. A streetcar line, here's the NSP employees building the streetcar line out to Dilworth out there, and it was extremely popular. However, I was told years ago by a Xcel Energy executive that the real reason they wanted to build a streetcar line out to Dilworth is not for transportation, but they wanted to sell electricity to this growing community, and nobody else was doing that at that time. Over the years, they made way more money selling electricity than they did in the transportation business. So the company did pretty well, but after World War I, prices started rose quite dramatically during the war. We saw inflation like we hadn't seen since the end of the Civil War, essentially. And these folks were locked into a nickel fare. And another problem was automobiles. Automobiles really became popular between 1918 1920. The number of automobiles in Minnesota doubled in those 2 years. They doubled again by 1922. So people, for just a few $100, you could buy a brand new Model T. For a lot less, you could buy a used car and go any darn place you wanted. You didn't have to ride the streetcar. So competition really played havoc with the streetcar line. And among the things that they did, they spun off a bus company. XLN, or NSP at the time, started a bus company called Northern Transit Company. So instead of continuing to build streetcar lines out to the new suburbs as the cities grew, you would get a transfer. You would transfer to a gasoline-powered bus at the end of the streetcar line, take your bus to the end of the destination. Another thing they did was try to get a 2-cent fare increase. And again, in order to get that past the voters of Moorhead, they had to offer something. People down here in the Second Ward, down in the Woodlawn Park area around Concordia College down here, for years have been clamoring for a streetcar line to their neighborhood. The company always said it was too close to the downtown to make it pay. But in order to get this 2-cent fare increase, they agreed to build a streetcar line down 6th to 8th Avenue South and then over to 2nd Street. This is NSP workmen putting in the streetcar line down on 6th Street. Now, all these things helped an awful lot, but this is a pretty fuzzy photograph, and I have to apologize for the quality of it, but if you look closely, it says Concordia College right here. This is streetcar number 28. This is the last streetcar that the company bought. They bought it in 1923 specifically to run down to on this line down to Concordia College, and there's a reason I'm showing you this photograph. Will become clear in a moment, shortly. But the most important thing that the company did in the early 1920s was go to a different style of streetcar. This is called a Birney car or safety car. They were called Birney cars for one of the inventors' name was Charles Birney. And these revolutionized streetcar traffic all over the country, or all over the world, really. They carried the same number of passengers, but they were much more energy efficient. And they were much safer as well, as their name would indicate. They operated a little different. They operated like our bus system. If you wanted to get onto the streetcar, you'd stand on the corner, you'd wave, and the motorman would stop, and you would enter through the front of the streetcar. You paid your fare as you got on, 7 cents, or they went to metal tokens at this time that you could buy at a discount. Go take your seat. Before you got to your destination, you'd ring the buzzer that would tell the motorman you wanted to get off, and you would exit through the front. So it was a lot safer. And it was also much more efficient because you only needed one guy to operate these things. You didn't need a conductor on the back. The conductors didn't lose their jobs. They just turned them into motormen. They basically doubled the number of streetcars on the street. So instead of most places having half-hour service, they had 20-minute or 15-minute service to most parts of town. They were also painted a bright yellow, kind of a Kodak yellow color for better night visibility. They had a couple of lights up here on the top. So if you're standing on the street corner at night and you saw a streetcar coming, you could see there was a red light and a white light, you know that was going to MSUM. If it was a green light and a white light, you know it was going to NDSU, and so on. These are some tokens from our collection, the F and the N series, and it still says Northern States Power Company on them, the real owners of the streetcar line. Well, not, like I say, in a lot of the old photographs, they look black, but that's a function of the photographic film that was being, or the photographic materials that was being used during the 1920s. It was relatively insensitive to yellow or orange light. So anything yellow or orange, like a streetcar or an automobile or a sign or something like that, turns out looking black in the final picture. They were actually this sort of a color. This is a painting done by a fellow named Albert Blauvelt. Mr. Blauvelt painted a series of pictures of when he was a kid, memories of when he was a kid in the teens and 20s. They're out of Bonanzaville now. And here you can see we've got a couple of kids getting a free ride on the back of the streetcar. Well, all of these things that the company did some good. It helped some, but the company continued to hemorrhage money. In fact, in 1942, the longtime manager of the company, C.B. Brown, addressed the Fargo Rotary Club and said that the company lost money every single year from 1919 until they stopped operations. NSP desperately wanted to get out of the streetcar business, but they couldn't. In 1912, they'd gotten a 25-year franchise, so they had to continue offering service till 1937. So in the summer of 1937, the first streetcar stopped running in Fargo. A couple of weeks later, they quit running on Moorhead. and we've had buses for our mass transit needs ever since. Northern Transit Company was sold to a local petroleum dealer, and we've had diesel-powered buses ever since. The streetcar bridge, the Old North Bridge, like I say, it never was much of a bridge. It was falling apart by 1942. It was closed even to pedestrian traffic, and the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, one of their last acts here in Fargo-Moorhead, tore down the bridge and changed it into tanks and battleships for the war effort. They took up most of the streets, or the rails out of the street too. However, in 1975, when downtown Fargo was mauled, if you remember that, they ran into streetcar tracks have probably been there since the 1920s. Just a few years ago, up at NDSU in front of the library up there, they were digging up that street, and they found streetcar tracks buried there. So there's probably all sorts of physical evidence around the streetcar line. A few years ago, I should say in 1937, the streetcars were taken up to Michelson Field in North Fargo, stacked up and burned. The metal parts are hauled off for scrap. As far as I know, only 2 streetcar bodies survived. One was sitting in a shelter belt out near Kindred. A buddy of mine ran into it when he was hunting one day. He told me about it. And he said that it was still painted that Kodak yellow color, but it had a tree growing through its roof. It had been there for some time. Since then, I found that the owner of the shelter belt has dozed it in, burned it, and that streetcar is gone. So there's only one that's left. In the 1980s, this streetcar sat behind a house that was over on 21st Street in Moorhead. When they built the underpass underneath the tracks out there on 21st Street over by the Moorhead High School, this home and the streetcar were destined to be demolished. So I got over there and I took some photographs of it. And it looks pretty rough, but actually the family had been using it as a storage facility and a place for their kids to play. They built a roof over the existing roof, and that actually protected the streetcar from weathering. They also covered the windows. All the glasswork was still there. I could peek through, and I could see inside. All the electrical fixtures were still there. The seats were gone. The control mechanism was gone. The truck, the motors and stuff like that were all gone. But the body itself was actually in not that bad of shape. And I noticed, if you look very closely on the side of the streetcar, it was still painted number 28. And this is that streetcar that was purchased in 1923 specifically to run down to this new Concordia College line. So it's got a strong Minnesota-Clay County connection. So we were excited about that. After the underpass was built, we lost track of the streetcar. Had no idea what happened to it. Then one day, a number of years ago, I was perusing eBay. We have a small buy fund. We can get stuff for the collections. And I happened to notice that somebody had a Fargo Moorhead streetcar for sale. And I thought, well, gosh, it's got to be 28. Looked into it, sure as heck. Yeah, it was. Apparently what happened is the owner of the streetcar had stored it in a barn down near Barnesville and was sending yearly checks to the farmer for storage fees. And then the checks stopped coming, and the guy took ownership of the streetcar and was selling it on eBay. So we were excited about that. So we threw in with Bonanzaville, and the deal was that our organization, the Clay County Group, would come up with an $800 bid. Bonanzaville would store the streetcar until we figure out what to do with it, and we submitted a bid, and as often happens on eBay, we lost out at the last minute. But the good news is the winners of the bid turned out to be an organization now called the Minnesota Streetcar Museum. Very well-heeled, very well-organized bunch, lots and lots of volunteers down in the Twin Cities. They have privately owned tracks that run around Lakes Harriet and Calhoun and restore streetcars. And if you go down there for a few bucks, you can take a ride on a restored Minneapolis or Hibbing or now Red Wing streetcar. And the plans are that at some point in the future, it'll be some years down the road, they're going to restore streetcar number 28. I have talked to the folks down there extensively, and they tell me it's not a very heavy streetcar. It would be pretty easy to put it on a flatbed truck and haul it up here, at least have it up here for static display so people can see what a streetcar was like here for us in 80 years ago. So we're looking forward to that, and with that, that's what I have for you folks this morning. I hope I haven't made anybody late for work. If anybody has any questions, I'd love to take them. Otherwise, I'm finished today. Yes?
I've heard that they had more riders in the 30s on the streetcars than we do on buses today. Jim, you know that number?
I think the ridership right before World War II was about 4 to 5 million rides, and now our metro area, it's less than 2 million.
Interesting. Interesting. Any other questions or comments? Yeah.
Maybe two, just related to the Union Heat and Power, the DC. What other, I'm just curious about, when, in a nutshell, when did they transform out of DC current in Fargo more entirely? And then what else did the DC current service besides the streetcars?
Those are two excellent questions, and that means I don't know the answer. But they're good questions. I'll have to look that up. Yeah, absolutely. Yes?
Given the history of the Mid-America Steel site, what do you think that portends for the future uses or possibilities?
That's up to you folks. Obviously, there's an area that really can't be developed. I think parkland makes a lot of sense down there in the low-lying area on the east end. But up on the high ground, it is really quite high. It can survive some pretty good flooding up that way. But it's exciting. Yeah.
You talk about Northern States Power. Is that related to Northern States Power, the big corporation that became themselves?
Yeah, same thing.
Did it begin in Fargo?
No, it began in Pennsylvania. Like I say, there's a guy named Billingsby that owned, his company was called Consumers Power, and it was later on, 1912, they changed the name to Northern States Power. Okay, all right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark.
Good luck.
Nicole's going to look at me. You have any ideas? Send them to Nicole Crutchfield. Or Shar Fisher. Thanks for coming.